Ever feel like you're being watched, even when you're totally alone? For me, that feeling is a constant reality. My name is Ilara, and I'm just your average college student, except for one small thing. I was born with what my grandmother called the third eye. It's not some mystical gem on my forehead. It's a perception, an ability to see things that exist just beyond the veil of our reality. I see the echoes of the departed, the lingering energies of lives once lived. Mostly, they're just faint outlines, like old photographs superimposed on the world. Harmless, or so I thought. My friends, oblivious to my secret, were obsessed with urban exploration. Their latest target was St. Jude's Hospital, a place that had been abandoned for over 30 years. The stories surrounding it were the stuff of local legend tales of malpractice, patient suffering, and a chief surgeon who vanished without a trace. While they were thrilled by the prospect of a spooky adventure, I felt a deep, unsettling dread. My sight was already buzzing, picking up faint whispers from the direction of the hospital, even from miles away. But peer pressure is a powerful force, and I didn't want to be the coward who backed out. So I agreed to go, telling myself I'd just stay close to them and try to ignore whatever I might see. That night, as we slipped through a broken fence onto the hospital grounds, the air grew heavy and cold. The moon cast long, skeletal shadows from the decaying structure. My friends, Jake and Maya, were giddy with excitement, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. For them, it was a game. For me, the world was already transforming. Faint, translucent figures began to appear at the edges of my vision. A nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her face a mask of exhaustion, walked straight through a crumbling wall. A patient in a thin gown shivered on a phantom bench, his form flickering like a weak signal. These were the usual echoes I was accustomed to seeing, sad but passive. We found an unlocked side door and stepped inside. The smell of decay, dust, and something vaguely chemical hit us hard. My friend's laughter echoed unnervingly down the long, dark corridor. The walls were peeling, gurneys were overturned, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. As we ventured deeper, the faint figures I'd seen outside became more solid, more present. I could hear their whispers now, not just as a buzz in my head, but as distinct words. "Help me," a child's voice pleaded from an empty pediatric ward. "It hurts," a man groaned from a room with a rusted operating table. My heart pounded in my chest. This was different. The energy here was stronger, more desperate than anything I had ever encountered. Jake, ever the daredevil, wanted to explore the surgical wing where the most gruesome stories originated. Maya was hesitant but followed him, and I had no choice but to trail behind, my senses screaming at me to turn back. The surgical wing was on the 3rd floor, and the moment we stepped out of the stairwell, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air wasn't just cold. It was biting, predatory. The whispers turned into a cacophony of agony. The spectral figures were no longer passive echoes. They were writhing, their faces contorted in silent screams. They seemed trapped in loops of their final, painful moments. I saw a surgeon, his hands stained with spectral blood, frantically trying to save a patient who was already fading away. I saw nurses running in panic, their forms glitching and resetting. It was a symphony of despair. I tried to focus on my friends, to ground myself in their reality, but the visions were overwhelming. We reached what must have been the main operating theater. It was a large amphitheater-style room with a single operating table in the center, directly under a massive, rust-caked surgical lamp. Jake walked towards the table, a cocky grin on his face. "This is where the infamous Dr. Alistair Black used to work his magic," he announced dramatically. He reached out and touched the corroded surface of the table. The moment his fingers made contact, a shockwave of energy, cold and malevolent, erupted from it. It wasn't visible to Jake or Maya, but to me, it was like a black ink bomb exploding in the spirit world. The room plunged into an even deeper darkness, and the spectral figures around us screamed, not in loops, but in fresh, immediate terror. A new presence had arrived. It was heavy, ancient, and filled with a chilling intelligence. The air crackled, and a shape began to coalesce in the center of the room, right where Jake was standing. It was a tall, shadowy figure, more solid than the others, its form shifting like smoke. It wore what looked like a surgeon's coat, but its edges were frayed and indistinct, bleeding into the shadows. Jake yelped and jumped back, not because he saw the figure, but because the table had suddenly become ice-cold to the touch. "Whoa! What the heck?" he exclaimed, shaking his hand. Maya just laughed nervously. But I was paralyzed, my eyes locked on the entity. It slowly turned its head, and even though it had no face, I could feel its gaze-piercing, analytical stare that seemed to see right through me, right into my soul. It knew what I was. It saw my third eye. A voice, not of a spirit, but of something far worse, echoed directly inside my mind. It was raspy, dry, like vocal cords that hadn't been used in decades. "You can see," it whispered. A statement, not a question. "You have awakened me from my rest. Now, you will be my new audience." Suddenly, the room around me dissolved. I wasn't in the abandoned hospital anymore. I was standing in the same operating theater, but it was pristine, brightly lit, and bustling with activity. But this wasn't a memory. It was real. I could feel the polished floor under my feet, smell the antiseptic in the air. Dr. Alistair Black. The figure from the shadows stood before me, no longer a smoky entity, but a solid man with cold, calculating eyes. He was performing a surgery, but his tools weren't for healing. He wasn't cutting into flesh. He was cutting into the patient's very soul, drawing out their life force, their energy, with ethereal, glowing instruments. The patient on the table, their spirit visible to me, thrashed and screamed in a way that transcended physical pain. The vision shifted. I saw Black experimenting on the spirits of those who had died in the hospital, trapping them, twisting them into grotesque shapes, feeding on their fear and despair. He wasn't just a surgeon. He was a psychic vampire, a monster who had turned this place of healing into his personal larder. He had used the hospital's ambient suffering to fuel his own dark immortality, and in doing so, he had become the anchor that trapped every soul who died within its walls. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, and I was back in the dusty, dark operating room, gasping for air, tears streaming down my face. Jake and Maya were staring at me, their faces etched with concern. "Ilara, are you okay?" "You just spaced out for a minute," Maya said, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. I could only look at the spot where the entity had stood. It was gone, but the cold lingered. And the voice was still in my head, a faint, mocking chuckle. "This city is my hunting ground," it whispered. "And you, my dear, can see everything. We are going to have so much fun." I stumbled back, grabbing Jake's arm for support. "We need to leave," I croaked. Now, there was no argument. The terror in my voice was real enough for them to understand this was no longer a game. We scrambled out of the hospital, not daring to look back. As we ran, I could feel hundreds of eyes on Mitha, trapped desperate spirits, and the cold predatory gaze of their keeper. My little secret, my third eye, was no longer just a passive quirk. It had become a beacon. I had stumbled into a war one never knew existed, and I had just alerted one of its most terrifying generals to my existence. The city I thought I knew was a lie, a thin veneer over a world teeming with malevolent spirits. And now, thanks to my sight, I was part of that world. The haunting of St. Jude's wasn't over. For me, it had just begun. And I had a horrifying feeling that Dr. Black was not going to let his new audience go so easily. Stay tuned for Part 2, where I try to understand the true extent of Black's power and search for a way to fight back against the darkness I've unleashed. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next.